Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the 7th Denman Forestry Issue Series entitled Federal Land Management Policy. We look forward to an exciting and informative program today. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issue Series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate our students, faculty, and staff, as well as resource professionals, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence in Forest Resources, and they support the college's vision of being a world-class and internationally recognized source of knowledge relevant to environmental and natural resource issues. The mission of the College of Forest Resources is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple spatial and temporal scales to include our urban, suburban, and wildland landscapes. In our college, we focus on programs in sustainable forestry, sustainable urban ecosystems, and sustainable forest enterprises. Sustainability serves as the cornerstone of our programs and includes all resources such as timber, water, or wildlife, for example, considers the needs of future generations as well as those of the present, and is concerned with ecological functions and conditions, and is as much a social and economic as an ecological process. Today, we wish to focus on the topic of natural resource and environmental sustainability issues related to the management and stewardship of our federal lands. Federal natural resource managers have witnessed a great deal of change over the past 10 to 15 years, and chief among these has been a shift from an agriculturally based model to an ecologically based model. Whereas the latter emphasizes desired future states of an ecosystem, the former emphasizes the level of resource outputs produced by the system. Today, federal resource managers focus more on what is left in the forest than what is removed. Restoration of the ecosystem and a more balanced use of resources is now a more common occurrence on our federal lands than in past years. And sustainable management is the stated goal of federal forest managers. Accompanying this shift in management emphasis on our federal lands has been a parallel shift in the identification of critical land management issues. In today's program, we will discuss some of these and learn of new developments at the national level. Recently, Forest Service Chief Dale Bosworth identified 4 challenges or threats to the national forest. These include the most appropriate way to manage fire and fuels, the growing occurrence of invasive plants, animals, and diseases, the loss of open space to development, and the growing occurrence of unmanaged outdoor recreational activities. Combined, the first 2 issues are often referred to as the forest health problem, the subject of President Bush's Healthy Forest Initiative, which is working its way through Congress. In addition, other topics of interest to Pacific Northwest federal land users include issues related to watershed protection and management, old growth preservation, grazing and wildlife habitat management, wilderness and roadless area management, and possible revisions of the Northwest Forest Plan. The Forest Service has also identified the following as significant management issues within the bureaucracy: the presence of excessive analysis and associated delays in planning and monitoring activities, an ineffective public involvement process, and management inefficiencies within the agency. They suggest that a modern management framework is required to facilitate a new era of public land management. With us today are speakers from government and higher education. During the hour, we will discuss federal land management policy from the USDA perspective. Our first speaker is Mark Rey, Undersecretary of Agriculture for Natural Resources and the Environment. He will present his views on addressing the great issues and the great diversions in natural resources management today. Following his presentation, we will hear responses from two UW College of Forest Resources faculty members who I will introduce in due course. Mark Rey was appointed Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment in 2001. He oversees the department's Forest Service and Natural Resources Conservation Service. In the past, Mark served as a staff member with the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, was Vice President of Forest Resources for the American Forest and Paper Association, and Executive Director for the American Forest Resource Alliance. Mark is a native of Ohio and holds Bachelor's of Science degrees in Wildlife Management and Forestry and a Master of Science in Natural Resources Policy and Administration, all from the University of Michigan. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Undersecretary Mark Rey.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Baer. As the Dean indicated, I have served in this capacity now just a few days over 2 years. And for those of you who wonder what that means in the life of a sub-cabinet official, I've come to understand that it means three things. First, I have served now slightly longer than the average tenure of a sub-cabinet official and can confidently and accurately call myself above average. Second, it means that I am now responsible for everything that has ever gone wrong with the Forest Service, everything that's currently going wrong with the Forest Service, and everything that ever will go wrong with the Forest Service until my successor has the opportunity to serve a comparable length of time. And lastly, it means that I am well on my way to setting a new indoor world record at being a named defendant in environmental litigation. The lecture here today actually involves a great deal more formality than I'm accustomed with. I tend to be relatively informal in my remarks, and that reflects my relatively modest ambitions. I've come to believe that if I can avoid being fired by either the Congress or the Secretary, I will have exceeded the performance of my three predecessors in this job. The subject that I'd like to address today is a couple of great issues and accompanying great diversions in natural resources management confronting our nation today. And in each of the three cases, what I'll talk about is the problem as I see it, what we must accomplish to solve the problem, what is diverting us, and then what we have done and what remains to be done. But before I do that, let me tell you why I believe we face increasing challenges in properly recognizing and timely responding to large-scale natural resource management issues as they emerge. There is, I think it's fair to say, at large across the body politic, broad public support for the protection of the environment. And this in turn provides the necessary mandate to address environmental issues. And this is particularly advantageous in times like these, where for at least a while, other concerns like the economy or national security issues will dominate public discussion. Broad public support serves as a watchguard. Even in times like these, there is little tolerance for weakening environmental controls, and that's good. Let me be emphatic about that. However, there is, I believe, a corresponding disadvantage to this dynamic, that is broad support with less intensity, in that the public's understanding about the nature of a problem can become fixed, particularly when organized interests become vested in addressing and dealing with certain issues. This can prolong the discussion of issues that are no longer as critical as they once were, and impede the necessary growing recognition of emerging issues that must be addressed. It therefore infuses the public debate with not only great issues, but also great diversions. Let me give you three examples of what I mean. First, in the area of forest and rangeland health. The problem we face today is the buildup and density of flammable fuels resulting from 100 years of fire suppression that has dramatically changed many of the North American ecosystems with which we're entrusted to manage. Stand densities are higher, fuel loads are heavier, and fires burn more intensively with catastrophic results. Add to that the effects of an extended drought cycle and factor in the rapid spread of insects through drought-stressed stands, and then finally add in the rapid growth of what our fire managers now call the wildland-urban interface as a consequence of rapid development. What we must accomplish is to create a sustainable and historically balanced ecosystem, focusing on the quality of the forest that is left behind rather than what is taken out. The diversion, as I see it, is to continue arguing about the level of commercial timber harvest on federal lands, now almost inconsequential in terms of our overall national consumption. What we've done to date is, I think, extraordinary in the few years that we've focused on this problem since the mid-1990s to present. Our predecessors developed the National Fire Plan, which was generously funded by Congress in 2000, and which called for the development of a comprehensive 10-year strategy and implementation plan, which we were able to do with the Western Governors Association in May of 2001 and August of 2002. What is left to do is to move forward and implement the priorities in the strategy and implementation plan, and that is what's reflected in the President's Healthy Forest Initiative. One of the top priorities in the 10-year implementation plan signed with the Western Governors was to review our decision-making processes and those of the states to find areas where we could improve on the performance necessary to deal with the hazardous fuels problem that we have today. And hopefully, Congress will pass the Healthy Forest Initiative sometime later this year. The bill has already passed the House, and a bipartisan compromise is emerging in the Senate for Senate floor consideration, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. Today, as we sit here, we've identified 190 million acres of federal forest and range lands at risk. We can count somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 million that deserve priority treatment because of either proximity to human property or significant ecological values that are at risk. Our rate of treatment has increased, but is still only occurring at about 2.5 million acres a year. At that rate, we will never solve the problem. We won't even keep up. So our objective, through the administrative and hopefully legislative changes that will be made shortly, will be to quadruple that rate of treatment, to be treating in the neighborhood of 8 million acres a year. And at that rate, we think that this problem can be addressed within a 15-year time frame, but it won't be addressed overnight. Let me talk about another problem that's facing us today, the fragmentation of rural and undeveloped landscapes. The problem is that we are seeing both wild and working rural landscapes disappear to more developed landscapes at a breathtaking rate. The fastest growing areas in the last census were Nevada, with a 66% rate of growth during the census period, Arizona with a 40% rate of growth, Colorado with a 30% rate of growth, Utah with a 29%, and Idaho with a 28% rate of growth. All intermountain western states where the growth is being concentrated in the exurban fringe or in the wildland-urban interface, not in inner city areas. From 1982 to 1997, more than 3.2 million acres of privately owned ranch lands were subdivided. And that complicates virtually every environmental challenge that we face in the Intermountain West. It has increased dramatically our fire suppression costs. It increases the conflict over water rights and water quantity. It compromises water quality, and it compromises some of the most valuable wildlife habitats because the privately owned ranches that are being subdivided are by and large old homesteads that were homesteaded because of their proximity to water, thereby making them ecologically more valuable. The issue is dramatic in the Intermountain West, but certainly not limited to that. The number of forest land owners is growing by about 150,000 per year without any comparable growth in forest land. By the end of the decade, the average private forest ownership will be about 17 acres. That fragmentation is occurring most dramatically in the southeastern United States, and overall, 21.8 million acres of forest land were lost from 1982 through 1997. That amounts to 4,000 acres per day, or 3 acres per minute. When I'm done here, 30 acres on the average will have been converted. What we must accomplish is to temper the love for open spaces with incentives to keep them. What I've just been describing is the dark side of both the environmental movement and the information age. The ability to value and treasure open spaces and to work far from a central location is in part what's driving these conversions. The diversion, as I see it, is continuing to argue over light or limited compatible development. For instance, the Clinton administration roadless rule. Certainly, there is a good and vibrant debate to be had over the disposition of the remaining roadless areas on the National Forest System. But consider that from 1982 to 1997, only 2.9 million roadless acres were accessed, the same time period during which we were losing 21.8 million acres of open space. What we have done is, through a number of new and newly funded programs, tried to provide incentives to retaining open space. The Farm Bill signed by Congress in 2002 represents the strongest statement in favor of working land conservation in our nation's history, with extraordinary increases in funding for the Farmland Protection Program, as well as the creation of new programs such as the Grassland Reserve Program and the Forest Landowner Incentive Program. Also, our Forest Legacy Program was reauthorized in the Farm Bill and was the subject of the largest single increase in any Forest Service budget line item in the budget that we sent forward to Congress this past January. What is left to do is to work on both tax code changes as well as building a broader public awareness of the risks and consequences associated with the fragmentation that continues to occur at an alarming rate. A third problem that begs broader public attention is a rapidly spreading problem that is not in any way successfully competing for public attention, and that's the problem with invasive species. 70 million acres of forest are affected or are at risk from invasive insects and pathogens, and 133 million acres of rangelands are infected or covered with invasive weeds. And these numbers are expanding quite dramatically at a rate of about 1.7 million acres per year. Aquatic systems are even more sensitive. Our aquatic biologists tell us that of 40 North American fish taxa, introduced species are responsible for 2 out of every 3 extinctions. Some of our analysts have put the total cost of damage and control costs at about $138 billion per year. What we must accomplish, simply stated, is to cross the threshold of public awareness that this is a problem crying out for attention. What we have done is to unify federal program budgets so that we have an accurate assessment of how much is really being devoted to this issue, and then increased federal budgets with a doubling of the Forest Service budget request for the invasives program. But what is left to do, in a word, is everything. We have to build a public charter, perhaps through new legislation, to afford the problem the attention it deserves. Now, if you were paying close attention, you will note that I skipped over the diversion. In my judgment, the diversion to dealing with this issue aggressively and forcefully is our continuing preoccupation with trying to either change or make work the command and control structure of the Endangered Species Act with the concomitant investments of time, attention, and money that have been devoted to that enterprise or those enterprises. To mix metaphors, we are rearranging the deck chairs on the ark. So those are what I look at as three of the great challenges that face us today, as well as three of the diversions that we continue to argue about, even as we try best to decide how to address those challenges. I look forward to working with all of you in the field to see what needs to be done. For those of you here on the faculty or practitioners in this area, I hope you're asking, how can we help? This is a common question I often get after inspirational speeches, such as the one I'm now completing. And I've devised an equally inspirational and compelling response. I don't know. You tell me. As I said at the outset, my ambitions are modest. Typically, I just ask open-ended and generally dumb questions to see who can provide answers that are relevant to the political environment in which I operate. So don't be prepared during the question and answer session to offer solutions. I like to empower smart people. Now, for those of you who are students here today, about to embark on your career, it's critical that you learn to be able to recognize the difference between great issues and great diversions in the ongoing public discourse that you're about to enter. And I will tell you that it's much more difficult than it sounds. And that's because as you go forward in your professional careers, you'll be focused on your issues, whether or not they're really issues or diversions. Admitting that they're not the great issues that should compel public attention will be the most difficult intellectual and personal challenge that you'll ever face. But as I sit here today, I can tell you that you have one overarching advantage. You live in extraordinarily interesting and unpredictable and rapidly changing times. So I have a few pieces of advice for the students here today. First, pay attention to what's going on in the world around you, and try not to let school get in the way of that part of your education. Understand that the university will give you everything you need to prepare you well for your first job, except perhaps an understanding of its larger place in the world. That you'll have to learn for yourself. And how you judge what is happening around you today will form both your intellectual roadmap and, more importantly, your moral compass for the future. And that, in turn, will determine whether you can assume the mantle and burden of leadership to take society past the great diversions and address and resolve the great issues. So with that, I'm going to relinquish the remaining 10 minutes of my time, and perhaps we'll use it for questions and answers. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for those comments. Our first respondent to Undersecretary Rey is Professor Jerry Franklin. Jerry is professor of ecosystem analysis in the UW College of Forest Resources, and he's also director of the Wind River Canopy Crane Research Facility at Carson, Washington. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in forest management from Oregon State University and his PhD in botany from Washington State University. Prior to that, he was a professor at Oregon State University and chief plant ecologist for the USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in Corvallis. He has published numerous research papers and books and has received many awards, including the William B. Greeley Award from the American Forestry Association and the Barrington Moore Award from the Society of American Foresters. He has been actively involved in the development of federal forest land policy for many years and was a member of the Federal Ecosystems Management Assessment Team. The title of Professor Franklin's response is Roles and Stewardship Challenges of Federal Forest Lands in the 21st Century. Jerry?
begin simply by stating an obvious fact for this audience, which is our public lands, our national forests, are great treasures. And we as a society value them. The occasional radical to the contrary, I think as a society we're not about ready to give up the bulk of our public lands. They provide extraordinary opportunities and resources for our citizens and for our society. And as I look at the 21st century, it's very clear to me they're going to be a major source of some critical goods and services. Obviously, open space and recreational opportunities. Habitat for native biodiversity, including that subset of we call wildlife, but we're really interested in much more than we used to think of as wildlife. We're interested in services such as the entrapment of pollutants, carbon sequestration. And most especially, whether we're looking at state or private or federal forest lands, we're interested in that product called water. And without question, I think in the 21st century, it will be the most valuable product of our national forests. And that is that high quality, well-regulated flow of water that is so important, so valued by our society, and yet which we don't tend to recognize and value as such. Some national forest goods that were important in the 20th century are obviously already, and even more so, are going to be much less important in the 21st century, most particularly wood. In large measure, it will not be needed. That is to say, national forest timber will not be needed. Indeed, it will be difficult to market. The global wood products industry has done an extraordinary job of evolving a very profitable strategy for meeting the wood needs of the developed world. And globalization and free trade really have put the exclamation mark on that. We aren't going to require wood from public lands. And I might note that the solution that's evolved in the global wood products industry is not really that bad a solution environmentally. And it's based on temperate zone fiber farms and not on exploitation of either native forests or tropical forests. But I'm not going to go any further than that. Other than to say that the loss of markets for national forest timber in the 21st century, I think is actually going to be a problem for us. Because essential ecological stewardship of the national forests and other public lands is actually facilitated by having a market for wood. It's actually facilitated by having a market for wood. In my view, in the 21st century, our biggest challenge with the federal lands, and specifically with the national forest lands, is going to be carrying out responsible stewardship of those lands. That's going to be our greatest societal challenge. Particularly, active management of many of these lands that will be critical to achieving the desired future conditions to sustain the kinds of outputs that we want, the goods and services that we really want from our national forests. So, you know, there's a lot of those lands out there that active management is simply going to be imperative. And I won't go into the many reasons for that. But it's very clear, for example, that we're going to have to manage a lot of these areas in order to get the well-regulated water supply that we want to. We're going to have to do it in order to maintain habitat to sustain native biodiversity. I will just simply use the same example that Mark used. We have only to look at the millions of acres of intermountain and Sierran forests at risk of uncharacteristic intense wildfires to see very clearly that there's going to be a lot of active management required. And guess what? You don't get to treat it once and walk away from it. In fact, the challenge is sustained management, decade after decade, in perpetuity. How will we train and retain the knowledgeable workforce that we need? How will we acquire the necessary sustained funding? How will we obtain the necessary social contract for active intercession in our federal forest lands? Real questions. And again, I want to say that there is going to be a lot of active management that's going to need to be done to maintain, to restore, to attain the desired kinds of functions and services that we want. So the issue is not, in my opinion, timber versus biodiversity. The issue is one of how, in fact, do we gain as resource managers the charter from society, the trust from society to allow us to begin to go out there and do what needs to be done. There are millions of acres of forest there and old trees that are at risk due to uncharacteristic fuel accumulations. I was in them with the students this weekend down in the Klamath country. Beautiful, gorgeous 500-year-old pine trees, and they're dead meat if we don't get in and remove the fuel ladders from around those trees. And if the fire don't get them, the bugs are going to get them. Now this, I might add, is the result of both passive activity, fire suppression, and active efforts on our part. We have created dense stands where they don't belong. We've done it on not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of acres. And I stood with the class yesterday in the Lone Pine burn of 1992, I believe, and it had been salvaged and planted. And they have done a wonderful job of creating the next uncharacteristic stand replacement fire. They took a site that basically has frequent light to moderate fire, and they have again recreated the dense contiguous stand that will burn in an uncharacteristic fashion. So it's not just passive, it's active. So the big issue, as I see it with the national forests, is how do we as resource managers, how do the federal land managers develop that social contract? How do we, in fact, get this broad social acceptance to actively manage on national forests? How do we gain the trust? And I'm terrified that we're not going to gain that trust, and we're going to lose incredible value as a consequence of it. So how do we, meet this proximate challenge of getting the opportunity to do what needs to be done? One of the things that I think we could do to create this trust are some very clear signals from the Forest Service and from this administration about some things that it will not do, as well as what it will do, and ensuring, in fact, a belief that it will do that for the general good of critical forest values, and not for the wood, and not for dollars. What kind of signals could be sent? Well, let me give you one example that I've touted for a long time, and that would be a clear message from the chief and from the administration regarding old trees. As a matter of policy, we could have a statement that there will no longer cut old growth forests, nor old growth trees, regardless of where they occur. And it has to be worded fairly carefully, because on the fire-prone sites where we have unnatural fuel accumulations, we will have to enter forests that are old forests, that contain old trees. But we could, in fact, adopt as a general policy, we will not enter old growth forests where stand replacement fires are the natural regime. And when we do enter fire-frequent forests, we will always retain the large, old, fire-resistant trees, just as a matter of principle. As a matter of policy, another principle could be we will no longer enter roadless areas. So we'll walk away from the old forest where it's appropriate, the old trees everywhere, and we'll walk away from the roadless areas. That would remove probably 90% of any environmental objection to the Forest Health Initiative. Not to the social issues of appeals and such, but certainly the ecological issues. There's a reason the roadless areas are roadless, and it has to do with the kinds of environments that they are. So those are examples, and I think they're two very specific examples that could clear out a lot of the underbrush, which is getting in the way of some very profound agreement with regards to treatments that need to be done and building the trust. Another issue that I have to mention, and it's one that Mark did not mention, is that we must address the issue of agency viability in the 21st century. And I have watched the agency, the Forest Service, for example, be downsized and downsized to a point where they're no longer capable of functioning. And guess what? They become an incapable, dysfunctional organization, and then the critics can point at them and say, see, this is a dysfunctional, incapable organization. We need to give these public lands to somebody who can do something with them, when in fact we have made it impossible for them to carry out their functions. We have to find a way to fund the Forest Service organization so it can fulfill its stewardship responsibilities. They have to stop being punished, effectively punished through the budgeting process for not cutting timber. Related to this is an incredible loss of memory by the agency. I mean, it's tragic. I see it. I see it weekly and monthly on the forests and districts that I work with. They're losing their memory. They're losing their understanding of what happened in the past on their forests and on their districts. People that have 40 years of experience in a place are retiring, they're leaving, and they're not being replaced. And that loss of memory, as well as capacity, is so critically important because good management only comes from people who have intimate familiarity with the property. I believe that. Contracting is a bad idea as a dominant paradigm because contracting does not carry with it that memory, that commitment. Now, I will grant you, you could come up with some local contracts and you could build continuity into it, but as a dominant paradigm, it's a bad idea. One other aspect of agency viability is we have to develop some balance. The Forest Service has lurched from one dominant paradigm to another. It was timber for 3 decades. Then it was biodiversity for a decade. And now it's fire. The only fully funded activity in the Forest Service today is fire. It's not only fully funded, it parasitizes every other aspect of the agency. Those of you who have research contracts with the Forest Service know what I'm talking about. So we need balance. Finally, I didn't have it in my remarks, but I just want to mention invasive species because Mark is right on. And I focus on tree pests and pathogens. And we are bringing them in at an accelerating rate. And I'm going to take a very radical position on this, the same radical position I've taken for a decade, and say we must stop all transport of live plants, unprocessed wood products, and untreated wood materials between continents. Flat out, we cannot continue to do this. There is no way that we can have an inspection system that'll work. It's time to stop moving green plants and raw wood between continents. Now, I know we've got a problem with that under free trade, but it isn't doing anybody on any continents any good at this point. And it's a potential disaster for us in North America. What if we had, instead of sudden oak death, sudden Douglas fir death? You think that's not going to happen? It is going to happen if we don't, in fact, make real efforts to prevent it. To conclude, 21st century is different. It ain't going to be the owl wars, the wood versus environment wars all over again. Forget it. That's History. Don't continue to fight that war. All we got is a few mop-up operations and skirmishes going on. That's not the big game in the 21st century. Wood, with regards to the national forests are not going to be an important contributor to the wood products industry. Not on this continent, not in the world. Carbon sequestration might be. Water and other services are overwhelmingly important, and we absolutely have to find a way to begin to make society value those. I don't know if we monetize it, I don't know how we do it, but if we don't, not just the federal lands, but what's going to happen to private forest lands if they don't have really the wood products market anymore? How are we going to keep those lands as good functional watersheds if we don't find some way to get society to value that service? Active management as a part of stewardship is going to be critical, absolutely critical to achieving societal goals. Anyone who thinks you can leave it to nature, I'll be glad to talk with them at length. That's bullshit, okay? Just flat out bullshit. Nature is not going to restore the historic conditions. It'll do something, but you aren't going to like what it is in many cases. Nature will accommodate it. You won't like it. Finally, dollars, viable, knowledgeable organizations, and trust are going to be critical to managing the national forests in the 21st century. So that's my view.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for those thought-provoking statements. I'm sure there'll be some questions directed to you towards the end of our program. Our second respondent to Undersecretary Rey is Professor Robert Lee. Bob is a professor of natural resources sociology in the UW College of Forest Resources. He received his bachelor's in forestry from the University of California at Berkeley, his master's of forest science from Yale University, and his PhD in wildland resource science from the University of California at Berkeley. Prior to joining the University of Washington, Professor Lee worked for the USDA Forest Service, the forest products industry, and the National Park Service. In addition to numerous research papers, Bob has written 2 books and has done significant research on forestry institutions and forest-based communities, where he has examined the relationships between human societies and natural environments. In 1993, he served on a panel appearing before the Clinton Forest Conference in Portland, Oregon. The title of Professor Lee's response is Policy Without Illusions.
Thank you. I'd also like to welcome Mark, and hope your stay here is as enjoyable as it was listening to you today. I happen to agree with most of what you said, so my comments are not going to be that critical. I think I'll try to extend what you've said into some other domains. And as you stated so clearly, federal land management policy takes place within a social context. And since my expertise is in sociology, I'll sketch out a bit of that context and how I see it changing. Anyone who's living in the current era can't help but sense that times have changed. We live in a time of uncertainty, a time of anxiety, a time some would characterize as a risk society. Sociologists have words for these things. We call it a postmodern society. Or to some people, it's a society without illusions. What does it mean to have a society without illusions? Acceptance of truth about the modern world. That means accepting the messiness of the social and political events. Accepting the fact that conflicting values often plague us and there is no common ground. It means accepting that we can't replace the irrationalities of the world with orderly rules, scientific plans, and systems theory. Foresters over the years have been taught and have aspired to this goal, to take the complexity of the forest, the society, and the economy, and to reduce it to a set of administrative rules. Another characteristic, and perhaps one of the more difficult characteristics of this risk society we live in, is re-enchantment of the world. The fact that now more and more people are accepting emotions and irrationality as the basis for their actions. This is a post-Enlightenment world. And in a sense, it recognizes the pathologies of the Enlightenment that took away some of the very things that make us human, and bringing those kind of human tendencies, the emotions, love, so forth, back into the equation. And this creates a whole set of dilemmas that I'll talk about. So I want to talk about policy and about illusions, and then some of the applications of this to federal land management policies. The Enlightenment view of policy that most of us were taught in forestry school is that it's a course of action selected among alternatives to guide present and future decisions. It's eminently rational. You can find that right out of Webster's dictionary. Now, in looking through Webster's, I found another definition that I think sometimes better fits our circumstances. It has to do more with insurance. I'd say it's more of a postmodern view. Policy is a daily lottery in which participants bet on certain numbers that will be drawn from a lottery wheel. And if the events of the last 10 years haven't taught us that at times this is more truthful than the rational view, then I don't think we've been awake. Uncertainty plagues us. Surprises continue to happen. Mark talked about diversions, and in a sense, that's what I was trying to get at with the notion of illusions. And Webster's would tell us that an illusion is a perception of something objectively existing in such a way as to cause a misinterpretation of an actual nature of something, a misinterpretation. So the diversions that Mark talked about are really where people fix on issues, have a preoccupation with something, very often for very important personal or social reasons. And this dilemma we face in the re-enchantment of the world means that people invest forests, water, animals, and so forth with meaning, with emotions that they hadn't historically. And they fix on those, they hold to those. And the rational analyst comes along and tries to say, well, perhaps we should consider alternatives, when in fact there's something fundamentally broken in the rational model. It won't work when you get this kind of re-enchantment of the world. And there's a downside to this re-enchantment, and that's that people can't see the emerging issues, can't see the world changing, because in a sense they hang on to what they love. So what does all this mean for federal land management policy? Many interest groups fix on issues, as Mark stated, and have a difficult time recognizing the new issues that are on the horizon. They can't engage the new agenda. And this tends to make government policy rather conservative and backward-looking, as if we're moving forward by looking in the rearview mirror. And government policy itself, because there's a lag in interest group action that leads to legislative action, that leads to regulations, tends to build in a very conservative emphasis where we are solving yesterday's problems with today's administrative procedures, and hence we don't see the emerging and the new problems. In a sense, it's an anchor to the past. Now, government institutions are no more successful than private interest groups in this. Our modern institutions in government are simply not capable, not equipped to move ahead and anticipate issues. That's not part of what they do well. So they also chase diversions and hold on to the past. And when they do get an issue, they try to reduce it to reasonable decisions. And yet many problems can't be solved with reason. So let's take a look then at what all this may mean, and what it may mean for some of the issues that Mark talked about. In a sense, the solution to all three issues, forest health involving fire and all the complexities that go along with that, forest fragmentation and the loss of open space with population growth and the repopulation of the rural counties throughout the country, and invasive species, all three issues simply cannot be solved, in my opinion, by taking rational government action in the development of regulations and new administrative procedures. And if one looks around the world and looks at history, how have people solved these kinds of problems? Usually because there are more human-scale institutions where people who have differences can come together and begin to work out solutions jointly. So what I'm suggesting here is that for us to address these major issues, we need institutional reform. And clearly, I'm not critical of Mark on this because, in fact, he is there to help administer the existing rules and regulations, when in fact I think what we need from the outside is a call for something very new and something rather radical, which is to look at how we could remake federal land management institutions not to give up on the federal lands, but to change how they're administered. And if we look around the world, we see that in country after country, federal forest services are slowly devolving authority to local administrative bodies. And those local administrative bodies, maybe at the community scale, maybe at a county scale, and usually in all cases, if they're successful, have a tiered sense of authority so that national concerns are brought to the attention of people who are living where the action is. And so it's not as if all administrative authority is turned over to local people. It's simply that that's recognized where the action is, and I think Jerry Franklin stated this very well. That's where the memory is stored, frankly. And when you store memory in a federal bureaucracy and it goes through these different kinds of waves of crusades, and you move into the new crusade, the old memory is lost. Whereas if that memory is stored with people who live and work near the land, who have familiarity with that land, then you get the maintenance of a memory, the building and maintenance of a memory. Now, there have been some experiments in this kind of local action. I think the Northwest Forest Plan, through its adaptive management areas, was a first step toward that. But it's only a first step. It was not designed in a way which would provide any kind of devolution of authority. And frankly, it was a top-down solution to what is basically a problem that can only be solved collaboratively between people, both local, regional, and national. What we need to address these major issues in federal land management are a few experiments where we set up some alternative institutional arrangements and just give them a try. See what happens. See if, in fact, a different way of administering federal lands can address the issues of invasive species, of fire, of fragmentation. Because I think that what's the most important here is that the public is with us on this. The public, as Mark stated, supports environmental protection. It supports a protection of the forest and all the different functions that forest serves, as well as its intrinsic values. And all we need to do is find a way of working with the public at a scale where they can be fully engaged. And that's certainly not going to happen if we continue to rely on centralized federal institutions. So, Mark, what I have to say is simply, that I think a more fundamental solution is required if we're to address some of those problems that you've raised with us today. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for your comments and observations. This concludes our discussion of federal land management policy, the USDA perspective. We trust that you enjoyed this program and that you found it to be informative. If you have questions, please send us an email addressed to cfruw@u.washington.edu. Thank you for watching.